Hello, and welcome to the course. I'm your host today, Stephen, and I'm speaking with Professor Ada Palmer from the Department of History. Professor Palmer's career is difficult to sum up, but here goes. She's an associate professor of early modern European history in the college, as well as an affiliated faculty of the Center for Gender and Sexuality Studies, and associated fellow of the Department of Classics, as well as a faculty fellow at the Stavanovich Institute on the Formation of Knowledge. Professor Palmer is the author of Reading Lucretius in the Renaissance, published in 2014, and is also a science fiction author who won the 2017 John W. Campbell Award for Best New Writer, and whose novel Two Like Lightning was a finalist for the Hugo Award for Best Novel. She's here to talk to us today about her career path and how she became a University of Chicago professor. Welcome to the course, Professor Palmer. Professor Palmer, thank you so much for joining us on the course. How are you doing today?
My pleasure. I'm doing well.
And you are coming to us from Italy, correct?
Yes, I'm over here both for research and to teach our study abroad.
Very cool. Thank you for taking the time this evening to catch up with us. Could you please tell us, your current job title and just a little bit in layman's terms, what it is that you do and what it is that you study?
Sure. I'm an associate professor in the history department, and I also have some associations with classics and with the Center on Study of Gender and Sexuality and with the Institute on the Formation of Ideas. And I often collaborate with the creative writing department, the games lab, and the Italian language and French language people. So like many at University of Chicago, I'm jumping back and forth between departments a lot. My main specialty is European history, and I look long-term at changes in ideas. It's not quite history of philosophy because it's not who invented what idea when and whether they're right or which ones are useful for our lives now. It's a question of the relationship between events and ideas. Why was calculus invented when it was invented? Why did all of the new innovations of the Renaissance happen when they did? How is this affected by wars, by crises? In the middle of the COVID pandemic, a lot of people were talking to me about the question of the Black Death. It was a major change for the globe, for especially Europe. And then the Renaissance comes along not too long after. Are these things related to each other? How does the Black Death influence the Renaissance and all of the art and culture and literature that we look at there? Can that help us predict what COVID will do in present to our art and our culture and our philosophy and so on? So I look at how big events like wars or coups or invasions or epidemics affect and stimulate changes in ideas.
Wow. Okay. That sounds really interesting and a bit of a tangent, but I'm wondering if you have just sort of a quick canned answer to a question that you just posed. Why was calculus invented when it was?
Notice calculus was invented by two different people at the same time. Leibniz in Germany and Newton in England both invented calculus at about the same moment. And that tells us that there was an acute need for this, that people were trying to solve problems that this was the solution for. And you're going to chuckle when I say, well, that's actually because of the Black Death, but that's the hilarious oversimplification of a lot of events over the course of the very late Middle Ages and then through the Renaissance caused an overturning in science in which the number of different scientific theories that Europe had access to proliferated, both because of discovering and rediscovering and having new interest in ancient materials, because during all the changes that happened after the Black Death, a lot of people started rereading books that were centuries old, looking for new answers to how does disease work? How do we treat it? How does engineering work? How do we make better concrete? How does statecraft work? How do we make better statecraft so we won't have civil wars like the Montagues and Capulets in Verona and Romeo and Juliet all the time? And that meant that the range of ideas that Europe was looking at got bigger. And then the Reformation happened, which meant that the range of different contradictory, quarreling ideas got even bigger, which caused a kind of a crisis in 1600 when there were so many contradictory theories that everyone decided, wait, we need a new method for determining what's true, a new method for sorting through all of these different theories, because we have so many more than we did a few hundred years ago. The scientific method is one of the things that Europe develops, at that point as a tool to sort out and test different hypotheses about what's true. And calculus is developed as a part of that need. We need new tools for measuring, examining, and testing and figuring out what's best in the sciences and mathematics, also in statecraft and in language study and in history. They're trying to figure out which of many contradictory ideas about history is right. And the feeling of crisis, the feeling of being overwhelmed by 100 different theories about the origins of humanity or 100 different theories about the right way to live your life day by day, is what stimulated the development of the scientific method, calculus, and a whole lot of other new tools people made in the 1600s to try to sort between and decide between different theories about what's true.
Honestly, I could spend the rest of the time asking you more about that history, but we want to get a little bit more into your own history, actually, and as well as talking about what you do these days. But we're curious, when you were, maybe like middle or high school aged kid, what did you want to do? What did you think you were going to do? And were there signs that you were going to end up in this field or no?
At that point, I was expecting to be a doctor or possibly a veterinarian. And in fact, even as an undergrad, I was a pre-med history major, which seemed like an odd combination.
It does.
But I was always fond of and interested in the sciences. But I also was fond of and interested in all sorts of things, art, philosophy, history. And my mom is an artist and my dad is a computer engineer. So huge breadth of what I was interested in. And I was very interested in writing as well, which is why in addition to historian, now I'm also a science fiction novelist and I write a lot. And for me, history became the way of examining all of these things because it's the history of when we came up with the scientific method, when we came up with computers, when we came up with engineering, the history of when we decided that medicine works the way we think it does now. Our ideas about medicine, our ideas about the germ theory of disease. Boy, was the germ theory of disease hard to arrive at. And once it arrived, it was really hard to convince people that it was true. So the germ theory of disease, which starts to proliferate in the late 1500s, but it isn't widely accepted for another century and a half afterward. And I look a lot at, and I'm interested in, and again, this is because I'm voraciously interested in all topics, medicine, everything. I'm very interested in ideas that aren't popular and how they nonetheless survive despite nobody believing in them. The germ theory of disease is around for 150 years as a weird fringe theory before it's really taken seriously. And when it begins, it's very controversial, but it doesn't just go away. It's not that someone writes about it and then no one reads it and we forget about it. Someone writes about it, nobody believes it, and then people continue to talk about it. I similarly look at things like the belief in atoms or the existence of vacuum. My first book is about atoms, and this is a theory that goes back to at least 350 BC, but that nobody really takes seriously until a couple people in the 1600s and then mostly in the modern world. And the interesting question is, how does an idea survive that long in an environment that's hostile to it? So my combination of interests in science let me sort of use history as a tool for zooming out and studying the sciences instead of pursuing and practicing one science.
Obviously, kept up a diverse array of interests, even as you have become a historian. But was there one moment or one sort of inciting incident or one experience that you think set you on the path to, get a PhD and ultimately,
There was a course I was in at my college. I went to a small liberal arts college, Simon's Rock, but we had a required seminar, which is actually based on the Chicago Core. And one of the classes we read Freud's Civilization and Its Discontents and some other works of Freud. And I remembered reading it, and I had just been watching a documentary about World War I. And I read Freud's discussion of the death instinct. Freud revised his ideas over the course of his career so that early in his career, he believes that the fundamental unit of psychology is desire. And we desire things and we act on that desire. And sometimes that desire is conscious, but a lot of the time that desire is unconscious. And if we figure out our desire, we can figure out what's going on in people's heads. But later in his life, he added the idea that there's a second destructive instinct, thanatos instinct, the death instinct, when people do things that are destructive or self-destructive, that there isn't just desire, that there's also a sort of negative drive.
Mhm.
And I remembered reading about this idea that there was a fundamental human impulse toward destruction and thinking, I don't think he would have thought that before World War One. I think
Mm.
he got that idea from World War One, from seeing what happened in World War One, from all of the unfathomably terrible destruction that was unleashed in World War One, and trying to incorporate that event into his ideas. And I remember going to the library, and there's this giant, many, encyclopedia-sized, many-volume complete works of Freud, and just plopping that on the floor in the stacks, pulling down the volumes and looking through. And indeed, before the war, no death instinct. After the war, death instinct. And it was the first thing that made me realize, wait a minute, the war shaped the ideas.
Mhm.
A philosopher isn't in a blank room philosophizing. He's in a lived world in which he's revising his ideas and coming up with some of our most important ones as a result of lived experience. And that to me was very exciting, because we tend to think of the world of philosophy as sort of abstractly aloof from the world of lived experience and pain and stress. We often, I think of the big names that we imagine as marble busts on pedestals as sort
Right.
of living lives that are aloof from our daily problems. We don't imagine them having to pay their bills or worry about laundry or fretting about their friend who's far away. And here was Freud fretting about his daughter who was far away.
Yeah.
And that fretfulness entered into his philosophy, and it made me think about the fact that these are not somehow perfect aloof people that are heroically better than everybody that we know. They're actually just people just like us, and I became excited in studying that. And now that I work a lot earlier, one of my favorite go-tos is Machiavelli. And Machiavelli's Prince is this enormously dominant, iconic work. Almost every Chicago student reads it in the core or in another course. I teach it regularly. And it's a brilliant work that revolutionized the arts, the practice of history, sort of found the discipline of social science in a lot of ways, and rethinks ethics. But I also love reading Machiavelli's personal letters, because in Machiavelli's personal letters, he worries about laundry and writes home to his wife, my shirts are all scuzzy and torn, and I have an important meeting with Cesare Borgia tomorrow, and I get to look all bad and embarrass everybody. And he writes home saying, my salary is late, I can't buy anything, I'm borrowing money from my friends who don't have enough money. And there's a great one where he's clearly like woken up at 3 a.m. fretting about the Swiss. This is a period when there's lots of Swiss mercenaries, and he's writing to his friend like, oh my God, the Swiss mercenaries could kill us all. What if they realized that they could just use the armies and conquer Italy? And then there's this wonderful reply from his friend, like, they haven't thought of it before. I think we're okay. Don't panic. So that, you really see the human being who is Machiavelli, who doesn't have enough money sometimes, and who does have to do laundry and worry about mundane problems, and gets crushes on people and gives his friends sex advice when his friends write to him for sex advice. We have Machiavelli sex advice. We have Machiavelli sex advice both for gay and for heterosexual friends. And Machiavelli's accounts of his sexual encounters with both male and female partners as well. And it just makes him a person who you might meet, a person who gets stressed out, a person just like us. And one of the things I love about history is that when you zoom in on it, you realize that the world isn't shaped by heroic people who are somehow better than us. It's shaped by people who are just like us and have our problems and get stressed out. And I was just rereading a letter of Michelangelo where he talks about a 1.5 year long period in which there was a war, and he was involved in a lawsuit, and a bunch of other stuff was happening. And he just wrote, and I didn't work on any art for 1.5 years because I was so stressed out I couldn't pick up a chisel. And it feels so much like us when we're experiencing stress in moments like COVID and so on. And you say, wow, even Michelangelo got too stressed out to work for 1.5 years. I feel better about myself now if I'm too stressed out to work sometimes, because so were all of these people that we admire.
Yeah, I have to say that's actually very comforting to hear all of that.
Machiavelli and Michelangelo, they were darn stressed out, and they did okay. So we will too.
Well, that's actually, I think counts. One thing that we ask is just, like what is some advice that you would have for younger people for potential PhDs? I think that already is getting to that. And can you sort of just briefly take us through an overview of your trajectory after college? From graduating from Simon's Rock to where you are now. What was your academic path?
I started at Simon's Rock because they're an early college and I was bored and lonely in high school. And I went there and it spent 2 years at its idyllic liberal arts paradise, and it was fantastic. But that moment when I sat down with Freud in the hallway was, early sophomore year. And I knew I wanted to do history. And I started already at that point getting in touch with potential mentors to do the history I wanted to do. Not a particular time and place, which is how people often pick it, but looking for historians who wanted to ask the kinds of questions I wanted to ask about history, about the relationship between ideas and events. And getting mentorship by getting in contact with potential dissertation advisors that early, I got the advice, languages. That the thing that most prepares you for history study is not actually history class.
Yeah.
It's being ready to read the primary sources.
Right.
And so I got the advice, if you want to do a history PhD, Simon's Rock didn't have ancient Greek and it didn't have strong Latin. And I already had French and some Latin. And so that prepared me very well for doing pre-modern European history. So I needed to transfer to somewhere that had the languages that I needed and also that was more used to preparing people for PhD. So I ended up transferring to Bryn Mawr College, which was a really difficult, painful decision because I loved Simon's Rock and I knew I would not be as socially happy at Bryn Mawr, and indeed I wasn't. But it gave me the right tools. It opened the right doors. It gave me Latin and it gave me Greek. And I then got straight into the PhD program with the very same mentor, James Hankins at Harvard, that I'd already been in touch with as a sophomore. Went straight to do the PhD. When I finished the PhD, my first job was at Texas A&M University in College Station, a very interesting place to spend a few years. And I had wonderful colleagues there. And then I got the job at University of Chicago.
Who were some of the most important people who helped you on that journey? Like when you look back, like who are some of the people you were really grateful to have supporting you through this?
So definitely I have more enormously supportive parents, which did tons and tons and tons. I also had very close relationships with a number of my roommates at Bryn Mawr College, to the degree that a couple of us still live together.
Oh, really? Wow.
It's been 20 years. We had our 20-year roommate anniversary, and we've been, dorm living is fantastic, and you're with other people who are excited about ideas and learning positive. And so I sort of still live in an academic commune with some of my Bryn Mawr friends and other friends I've acquired later. So currently we have a librarian, me as a historian, a person who studies 19th century science fiction, a astrogeologist who studies the formation of dunes on Mars, and a chemical engineer who is working on treatments for atherosclerosis. And we until recently had a linguist, but now he's off at Yale. A microcosm of what it's like to be at a university, having those wonderful people so that we have very interdisciplinary conversations over the table. And I just wanted to sustain that experience, which began with undergrad the whole way. And then I had some wonderful faculty mentors. The biggest ones would be Alan Kors, who is a historian, recently retired now, though he and I are still in touch at Penn, who does the kind of history I wanted to do, the relationship between ideas and events, and is just a stimulating lecturer. The first time I was ever moved to tears by a lecture, but also a wonderful person to talk to about the necessity of history and how important it is for us to ask these questions about how ideas are shaped, because it's often so counter to the way we tend to think of ideas being shaped. And especially how much curmudgeons and people who were wrong and people we disagree with were nonetheless essential to the formation of ideas, because ideas don't happen with someone comes up with it and everyone says, yes. Ideas happen because someone comes up with it. A lot of people say no and want to argue with it and spend lots of times arguing it. And his work shows and helped me show how more people were introduced to Galileo by people coming up to them and saying, hey, this guy Galileo is wrong. Here's my argument about why he's wrong. That the dissenting voices and the people that a time traveler would show up at and say, you're an idiot, are nonetheless huge contributors, because it's the debate and the conversation that makes ideas change. And so we have to co-credit those we disagree with the triumph of those ideas we do agree with, because their debate and testing of the ideas is often as responsible, if not more responsible, for disseminating it than the original person who came up with it. And we need to not erase from our histories the people who were totally wrong. So often a history of philosophy will be, here's a person we think was smart and right, and here's another person we think was smart and right, and here's a third person we think was smart and right, and he's the one who taught me how to teach it as, and here's people we think are totally off the loop, and yet they were essential to the ideas as well, and to the changing and shaping of society. So Alan Kors was a very precious mentor. James Hankins, who eventually became my dissertation advisor and introduced the Renaissance to me. I mean, I wouldn't be sitting here in Florence in a sketchy Airbnb with the power going out every few minutes without his wonderful advice that you should do your dissertation on, that you should choose your dissertation topic based on the cuisine of the area to which you must travel for your research, which is some of the most memorable advice I've ever received. So he's wonderful. And then the third I'll name is Hal Holliday, who was my first serious writing teacher in college. He was one of the first people who ever gave me a harsh grade on a paper, because all the way through high school, it had always been easy to get an A on a paper. And it was not easy in his class, because he pushes to very high writing standards. And he was the first one to talk to me about the fact that writing is a slow apprenticeship. There are some skills that come quickly. And there are some skills at which one can be a natural genius, right? There are math geniuses, and there are music geniuses, and there are, people who are brilliant gymnasts or brilliant swimmers super young. But there are other skills that come slowly because that skill is slow. If you look at the Olympics, for example, you'll notice the average age of fencers is considerably older than the average age of many other people who are doing sports, because fencing is a slowly learned, slowly mastered craft that takes years longer for your body and your mind to master it than many other sports. And writing is like that. Nobody is a writing genius. Writing is a slowly acquired skill that requires patience. And he was the first person to talk to me about that, because as someone to whom most skills had always come quickly and easily, it was hard to tell the difference between that and one that built slowly, and that was invaluable advice for years. And when I eventually did publish my first science fiction novel, it wasn't the first science fiction novel I wrote. It was the fifth science fiction novel that I wrote. It was the first science fiction novel that I published. And every one of those earlier projects was that slow apprenticeship, learning to be good at writing. And my lectures are part of that, and my academic publications, and even my dissertation was part of practicing writing as a slowly gained skill. And it was very important and in many ways difficult to learn, as many do. And I see Chicago students face this all the time and try to help them through it. What it means to transition from high school, in which often your skill level is high enough that things aren't work, or only a couple subjects will be hard. You might find that memorizing vocabulary in a language class is hard, but most other things are easy, or that keeping straight the equations in physics is hard, but other things are easy. It's different for everyone. Or that spelling is my nemesis. Spelling is hard, but that other things are easy. But when you come to the university for the first time, you're being challenged to do, maximum human capacity level work in all of your classes. They are asking the most that a human being can give. And for a lot of people who've never been asked for their most, they've only been asked for their 80% a lot of the time. It can feel like something is going wrong, or it can feel like it's just you. And it's not. It's that you're coming to one of the places in the world that asks 100% of human capacity, and you learn to give it. But it's very, very different from what comes before. And it is genuinely hard, as it should be.
Yeah, that's an interesting way of describing the academic environment. I mean, I like that. It's challenging. It's asking a lot of you.
Yeah. Well, and one of the things that means, which I consider important to bring up, is that you struggle. And the correct solution to struggling is not to just keep struggling harder. It's to say, okay, I need to figure out how to help maximize myself. So, taking off my historian hat for a moment and my science fiction hat, I'm also disabled and I'm also a disability activist. I'm a chronic pain sufferer with several different invisible chronic conditions that overlap. I sometimes walk with a cane, I sometimes don't. One of the things I work with a lot at the university is trying to get students to recognize it isn't the right path to just push yourself harder. I remember hearing 3 grad students in the hall one day outside my office, and one of them was saying, "Oh, yeah, I'm working so hard these days. I only got 5 hours of sleep." And the next one said, "Well, I only got 3 hours of sleep." The third one said, "Well, I pulled an all-nighter." And I opened my door and said, "I played Dungeons and Dragons last night and then went to bed at 11 o'clock and slept for 8 hours. And this morning I got up and worked on a chapter and it went really well because I had enough rest." Go rest. It's a diminishing return situation when you don't take care of yourself. And a lot of college asking 100% of you is that it's also the moment that you learn how to balance self-care, which is also a scholarly duty, with the rest of it. And you learn that diminishing returns thing of, if I only study or I only work, I start producing less per hour. If I rest, if I get the right amount of sleep, if I get the right resources, if you have a disability so that you need, whether it's a medication, I'm on lots of medications, whether it's physical therapy, whether it's exercise that makes your body and brain work better. One of the other things about college is that you're being asked to supply 100%. And so that means learning how to take care of yourself, learning to guard your sleep, learning to choose those leisure activities which are regenerative, as opposed to those leisure activities which are not regenerative. Hanging out with friends, doing something interactive, playing Dungeons and Dragons, playing a video game with multiplayer so that you're interacting with friends. Psych studies show us these are much more mentally regenerative and actually make you feel better, more so than watching television alone or playing a video game alone. So just learning things like that about ourselves is also part of what college is for. So you come out the other end knowing how to sustainably produce at your best, because we're not doing a sprint, we're doing a marathon.
Yes. Yeah. And I, not that anyone asked for my advice, but that's something that I remember so vividly from undergrad is how it seems like a competition to see who got the least sleep sometimes. And I just remember thinking that doesn't seem the best way to approach this experience.
Yep. And the students who manage their studies best and most often manage to, do everything they hope to and get it in on time and be done are the ones who say, "You know what? Even though this thing is due tomorrow, the correct thing is to ask for an extension so that I can sleep and write it when I've slept."
Yes.
Or even though taking an extra additional class sounds tempting, I'm going to take a slightly lighter load to make sure that I have enough time to sleep. And then I can read books on the topic on my own time, whatever it is. That self-care is one of your highest teaching or study scholarly duties.
Yeah, I think that's important for people to remember at any point in their academic journey. So we actually just have a few minutes left, and I just wanted to end with the question that we have been asking all of your colleagues. I mean, you've listed a lot of things that it sounds like are gratifying to you. You have several different careers, obviously going on here. So I know this could be a really big answer, but looking at your academic work, what do you find most gratifying about what you do in your field?
What I really like is connecting together different projects that I run across that different people are doing that I realize connect to each other. A lot of historians specialize in one region and one period, so they'll know that time and place really well. My work tends instead to be one narrower band of questions over a longer range of time and places. It's kind of perpendicular to the usual slice. So if there's plaid, I'm the vertical stripes instead of the horizontal stripes, right? And lately, for example, I've been working a lot on censorship and the history of censorship, because that's core to how do ideas survive and move around and get transmitted when people are hostile to them? Well, how do they survive under censorship? So my current big book project is that I'm working on a book on the history of motives of censors and what makes people assent to censorship, what makes people say, yes, I will work as a censor. Yes, we should do this. And what those patterns are. And what that means is that I'm using my own expertise on Europe, but I'm also reaching out and connecting with colleagues who work on Korea under Japanese occupation during World War II, and who work on ancient Mediterranean empires, and who work on New Zealand and who work on the USSR and who work on what's happening with the digital revolution right now in Twitter, and who work on modern China, and who work on the EU and the history of its engagement with censorship. And I'll often, what I love is talking to someone and say, hey, oh, that thing you just described in modern China, let me introduce you to a friend who works on 17th century copyright law. It's exactly the same as the thing you just described.
Yeah.
And then I'll introduce them, and they'll start talking, and they excitedly say more and more to each other. And I create these sort of partnerships in which I have the correct long range over time of knowledge to put together people. So a couple of years ago, I did a project on the history of censorship where I got a bunch of people who work on modern censorship, not just scholars, but activists and lawmakers and lawyers who work on digital censorship, together with people who work on, Gutenberg and people who work on the origins of copyright law in the days of Shakespeare and Milton. And my wonderful colleague, Kathleen Ballou, who works on the KKK and the U.S., his histories of trying to silence hate speech and how complicatedly that intersects with other efforts at censorship and so on. And just had them talk to each other and filmed it. It's online. This project on censorship during information revolutions and what it does. And I love that. I love connecting together people who didn't realize that the moment that they're looking at has a parallel, 200 years earlier in another place.
Many thanks to Professor Palmer for joining us today. And course takers, if you enjoyed listening to today's interview, please check out the other ones. You can leave us a comment, subscribe, follow, and share this episode with your friends and family. You can also find out more about the University of Chicago through uchicago.edu or the university's campus in Hong Kong through uchicago.hk. Stay tuned for more. We'll see you around.